At 7:42 a.m. on June 10, 1944, Feldwebel Dieter Kraus crouched under the wing of a Messerschmitt Bf 109G-10 at an airfield near Münster, watching his pilot, Lieutenant Egon Voss, climb into the cockpit. The sky was a pale, hostile blue, and the drone of incoming American heavy bombers was already a faint tremor in the distance. Voss was 20 years old, 6 combat missions, 2 unconfirmed kills. He was flying a late-model Bf-109, the workhorse of the Jagdwaffe, but an aircraft facing technological obsolescence against the relentless tide of Allied air power. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us share more forgotten stories. Today, Voss would be intercepting formations protected by the Royal Air Force's finest, the Supermarine Spitfire Mach-109s. Kraus had been maintaining 109s since the disastrous Battle of Britain, 4 years of desperate tinkering. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Superb climber, blistering dive speed, and a deadly nose armament. But the 109 had one fatal unaddressed design flaw that was killing German pilots every single week. It couldn't match a Spitfire in a sustained turning fight, and more importantly, its roll rate was marginally, fatally slower to initiate. The Spitfire, lighter and with its elegantly elliptical wings, could change direction, roll with a snap and precision the heavier, constantly modified 109 could not sustain, especially at medium altitudes where most dogfights occurred. That fraction of a second difference in roll initiation meant the Spitfire pilot could duck inside the 109's turning circle, gain a crucial lead, and send a burst of cannon fire into the Messerschmitt's engine. German doctrine, born of necessity, preached vertical tactics. Boom and zoom, use the 109's superior climb rate and dive speed to hit the bomber streams. Avoid prolonged turning engagements with the escorts. But Voss had tried that doctrine 5 times. It hadn't worked. The Spitfire pilots were too skillful, too aggressive. They baited the German fighters into horizontal turns, used their superior instantaneous turn rate, and stayed on the 109's tail. Jagdgeschwader 51 had lost 41 fighters in the past 2 months. Most were shot down after being caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape, or while trying to roll away from an attacking Spitfire. Kraus had watched too many young men die. Good boys, fresh from training, climbing into their 109s with confidence and coming back in body bags or not coming back at all. The training manual blamed pilot error. The instructors said the pilots weren't disciplined enough to stick to vertical attacks, but Kraus knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots. It was the aileron control system, slack. The Bf-109's aileron control cables ran through the wings from the stag in the cockpit to the ailerons on the trailing edge. This cable system, due to the need for manufacturing tolerances in expansion room at high altitude and cold, inevitably had a slight amount of slack, maybe a few millimeters of play at the stick's maximum throw. But that tiny bit of slack created a perceptible brief delay between the pilot's movement of the control stick and the actual physical deflection of the aileron surface. At very high speeds, the aerodynamic forces mask this lag, but at the critical speeds and altitudes of a turning dogfight, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between initiating a roll fast enough to escape a Spitfire's gun and getting shot down. Kraus had mentioned this to the technical officer 3 months ago. The officer, a non-flying desk man, cited the Werkvorschriften factory specifications. The cable tension was within tolerance. Changing it would be an unauthorized modification to a flight-critical system, potentially voiding the aircraft certification and carrying the risk of a military court-martial. Modifying a flight control system required engineering approval from Messerschmitt's headquarters, which might as well have been 1,000,000 kilometers away, lost in bureaucratic paper. So Kraus did something that violated every technical directive in the Luftwaffe Instandhaltungsvorschrift. He took a piece of high-tensile steel wire from a damaged communications antenna, a salvaged piece of what they called Antennendraht antenna wire, cut it to a short length, bent it into a precise S-shape, and installed it as a tensioner on Lieutenant Voss's primary left aileron control cable. The unauthorized modification took him less than 10 minutes, performed under the cover of a routine inspection panel. It added less than a kilogram of preload to the cable, but eliminated the slack entirely. Nobody noticed. The morning pre-flight inspection crew was focused on fuel levels and cannon ammunition. Krauss said nothing. He watched Voss taxi out, watched the 109 lift off, watched it climb into the morning sky toward the Allied fighters. What happened in the next 20 minutes would change how every frontline Bf-109 pilot in the West fought. The first pilot Krauss lost was Unteroffizier Rudi Fischer, April 12, 44. Fischer had been in the squadron for 2 weeks. Krauss had done the final rigging checks on his aircraft every morning. They shared cigarettes and talked briefly about Fischer's Bavarian home. Fischer took off on an interception and came back with a shredded right wing and a story about a Spitfire that had seemingly materialized inside his turn. Fischer said he tried to roll hard right to gain separation and reverse the fight, but the aircraft felt sluggish to respond, like there was a lead weight in the wing. The Spitfire, he said, had kept pace easily, cut into his turning radius, and almost killed him. Only the sudden intervention of his wingman saved him. Krauss examined the damage: tight, accurate grouping of 20mm cannon rounds. Perfect deflection shooting. The Spitfire pilot had timed the 109's roll rate perfectly. That shouldn't have been possible if Fischer had rolled instantly and aggressively. The only explanation was that the aircraft had delayed just long enough for the Spitfire to get the correct lead. Fischer didn't fly that aircraft again. It went to the repair depot. Krauss never saw him again, hearing weeks later he was killed flying another 109 over Berlin, caught in a turning fight, unable to roll out fast enough. The second loss was even harder. Hauptmann Wilhelm Hess. Hess was a veteran, an expert with 18 confirmed kills. He knew the 109's limitations and flew with ruthless discipline. On May 18th, Hess's Schwarm flight intercepted 4 Spitfire Macaque 9s at 15,000 feet. Hess destroyed one on the first pass. Coming around for a second, he was bounced by 2 others. Krauss later heard the radio traffic. Hess attempted a high G brake turn, calling out that his controls felt already soaked and unresponsive. The Spitfire stayed with him through the maneuver. One got a clean burst into his cockpit. Hess crashed near the airbase, dead on impact. Hess's crew chief, an older man named Schmitt, was devastated. Schmitt meticulously checked the recovered wreckage. Everything was within specification: engine compression, control surface rigging, cable tensions. Nothing wrong with the airplane. The official report, of course, was pilot error in the face of superior enemy maneuvering. Schmitt didn't believe it. Neither did Krauss. By early June, Krauss had lost 8 pilots he knew by name. He'd signed off on the maintenance logs for all their aircraft, watched them walk out to machines that couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. The surviving pilots told the same story. The 109 felt slow to respond during hard maneuvering, a slight lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots just thought that was the nature of the heavy G-series. But Krauss, with his hands deep in the greasy cable runs, knew the reality of the slack. He started paying attention to the specific sound the cables made when he checked them: a low, resonant thrum for loose cables, a tight, higher-pitched ping for properly tensioned ones. Every 109 on the line had the thrum within spec, but wrong. He showed Schmitt the cable play one evening after Hess's funeral. Schmitt asked what could be done. Krauss just shrugged and said, "Nothing official, but unofficially, well, you risk the firing squad." Lieutenant Egon Voss was the tipping point. 20 years old, farm boy from Saxony, desperate to succeed. He'd flown 6 missions and had 0 kills, not because he was a bad pilot, but because he was trying to follow the rules, and the rules kept putting him in the firing line. On his 4th mission, Voss dove on a Spitfire from altitude. He lined up the shot, started to pull lead for deflection, but the Spitfire snap rolled away. Voss tried to follow. The 109 started its roll but felt, as he described it, "Why in syrup," like it was in syrup. By the time his aircraft aligned, the Spitfire was gone. His 6th mission was nearly fatal. 2 Spitfires jumped him. Voss tried everything: scissors, yo-yos, rolling maneuvers. The Spitfire stayed glued to him through every move. Voss heard his own voice crackling on the radio, calling for help, saying his aircraft wasn't rolling fast enough. He escaped only because the Spitfires broke off when the rest of his staffel arrived. Voss did not sleep that night. Neither did Krauss. The next evening, June 9th, Voss found Krauss working alone in the hangar. Voss was pale, his eyes wide. He asked if there was anything Krauss could do to make the airplane roll faster. He didn't care about regulations. He just wanted a chance to live. Krauss looked at the young pilot, saw the cold, rational fear in his eyes, saw a kid who knew he was going to die if something didn't fundamentally change in the mechanism he relied on. Krauss told Voss to come back in the morning and he would see what he could do. Krauss worked alone that night. The air in the maintenance hangar was thick with the scent of aviation's spirit and fear. He pulled the inspection panel off Voss's BF-109G 10-wing route. The aileron control cable ran inward toward the cockpit linkage. He grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled. Felt the 3 millimeters of slack, the gap between input and response. It was wrong. He knew it was deadly wrong. The antenna draught came from his personal toolbox, a piece of high-tensile spring steel he'd kept for its resilience. He sat on the floor, bent the wire into a precise, small S shape using pliers and a small hammer. It was a simple, elegant piece of engineering. The S shape would act as a non-linear inline spring, adding just enough constant tension to the cable to eliminate the slack without overstressing the pulleys. Installing it was a nervous, delicate job. The space was tight. His hands, slick with oil, fumbled with the clevis pin. He dropped it twice. His heart hammered in his chest. Discovery meant disaster. If the technical inspector found an unauthorized, non-standard material in the primary flight control system, Krauss would be tried for sabotage. But Voss was going to die if he didn't do this. He jammed the S-shaped tensioner between the cable end and the linkage, forcing the clevis pin home. The fit was perfect. He tested the tension by hand, no slack. The control surface moved immediately with the slightest tug. Perfect. Krauss replaced the inspection panel, wiped the grease and his cold sweat from the wire and his hands, and walked out at 1:45. He did not sleep, instead watching the false dawn bleed over the airfield, waiting for his life, or Voss's, to be judged by the unauthorized piece of wire. At 7:55 a.m., Voss took off. Krauss stood by the hangar door, watching the 109 climb out. It joined the Staffel, turning south towards the expected bomber stream. The engagement started at 0831. Voss Staffel intercepted a box formation of B-17s, heavily protected by a massive umbrella of Spitfire macaque A9s. Voss was flying the Rada wingman position. After the initial pass on the bombers, the formation broke up. Voss found himself engaged by 2 Spitfires who had seen him break away. The first Spitfire pilot, an experienced veteran, tried the classic move, a hard scissors maneuver to force Voss into an overshoot or a slow turn. Voss rolled hard right to follow. That's when he felt it. The Messerschmitt responded instantly. No dead zone, no mushiness, no lag. The stick moved and the aircraft rolled with a violent immediacy he had never felt in a 109. It was like the wings had shed 1,000 pounds of dead weight. Voss had never experienced his 109 move like this. He snapped the roll, matched the Spitfire's turn radius, and found himself suddenly positioned inside the Spitfire's turning circle. The Allied pilot, accustomed to the typical 109 delay, had overcommitted. Voss got the Spitfire squarely in his Revy sight, held the stick steady, and fired a short, vicious burst of the 30mm cannon. The Spitfire's engine instantly erupted in flame. Voss's first confirmed kill, but there was no time to celebrate. The second Spitfire, seeing its leader downed, reversed hard and tried to come in from above. Voss shoved the throttle forward, executed a climbing, snapping left turn, and pulled a high G maneuver that should have left him bleeding speed and vulnerable. But the 109 responded with brutal efficiency. The aircraft was doing exactly what he wanted the moment he demanded it. It was like flying an extension of his own hand. The Spitfire pilot was baffled, misjudged the 109's closing speed, and overshot. Voss was instantly on his tail. Close range, less than 150 meters. He fired. The Spitfire disintegrated, pieces falling away into the cloud layer. 2 kills in under 2 minutes. The remaining Allied fighters quickly disengaged, surprised by the 109's unnatural agility. Voss climbed back to altitude, reformed, and headed home. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. When Voss landed at 0912, Krauss was waiting. Voss shut down the engine, climbed out, his flight suit soaked, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He walked straight to Krauss, unable to stop grinning. He only needed 2 words. Es funktioniert. It works. What neither of them realized was that 3 other Experten had witnessed Voss's engagement from a higher altitude. Major Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Staffel commander, had watched the entire fight. Rudel knew Voss was a mediocre pilot, but the aircraft he flew was maneuvering like nothing Rudel had ever seen, rolling and reversing with the speed of a lighter FW-190. Rudel, a veteran fighter pilot with scores of kills, was stunned. Something was fundamentally different about Voss Messerschmitt. After landing, Rudel cornered Voss in the debriefing room. Voss could only stammer that the airplane felt faster, sharper. Rudel was a man who bypassed bureaucracy. He didn't care about regulations. He cared about survival and kill ratios. He demanded to know what maintenance had done. Voss pointed directly to Feldwebel Krauss. Rudel found Krauss in the hangar 2 hours later, his hands black with oil. Rudel asked him directly, "Feldwebel, what have you done to that boy's machine?" Krauss, facing the most decorated man in the entire Jagdwaffe, calmly told him. He explained the cable slack, the factory tolerance, the need for instantaneous roll response, and the simple S-shaped piece of antenna wire used as a tensioner. Rudel listened without interrupting. When Krauss finished, Rudel didn't threaten him with court-martial. He simply asked, "How many hours does it take? Put the wire in mine. Now." That evening, Krauss modified Rudel's Bf-109. The next morning, Rudel flew a combat patrol and returned with a triumphant landing, confirming 2 Spitfire kills. He told his squadron leaders, "The plane is new again. That foolish wire is saving our lives." The word spread like wildfire through the Jagdgeschwader. Pilots demanded the modification. Crew chiefs, realizing this was a matter of life and death for their young charges, stopped refusing and started asking Krauss to show them the trick. He showed them how. Scavenge a piece of high-tensile wire, bend the S-shape, install it as an inline tensioner, remove it before depot inspection. 10 minutes of work, a lifetime of difference. The modification became known unofficially among the ground crews as the Krauss trick, Krauss's trick. By the end of June, maybe 70 Bf-109s across the Western Front had the modification. The technical staff at the main depot noticed discrepancies in cable tension during scheduled overhauls, but the modified aircraft had always had the wire removed and the cable tension readjusted to just within factory spec, only for the tensioner to be reinstalled hours later. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, and the officers who flew the modified planes knew. Nobody talked to the inspectors. The kill ratio shift was impossible to ignore. In May, German pilots in the West were losing nearly 2 Bf-109s for every Spitfire or Mustang destroyed. By the end of June, the ratio was approaching parity. Something fundamental had changed in the skies over Germany. Then the British noticed. RAF and USAAF intelligence reports from early July 1944 began reporting that the Bf-109s were maneuvering abnormally. Experienced Allied pilots complained that the Germans were rolling out of their attacks far too quickly, executing turn reversals that were previously impossible for the heavy 109G series. Squadron leader Peter Davies, a Spitfire ace with 14 kills, reported after an engagement near Leipzig that a 109 had outrolled him in a defensive maneuver. "I banked hard left, expecting his usual slight hesitation, and he just snapped with me, getting his nose in line before I could adjust my lead." He shouldn't have been able to do that. Allied intelligence tried to determine the cause. They examined the few 109 wreckage pieces recovered, finding no new aileron mechanisms, no hydraulic boosters, no design changes visible to the naked eye. The change was hidden, a small, simple piece of bent wire that looked like a bit of rigging debris if you did not know its function. The psychological impact on the Allied side was significant. For months, the Allied pilots had relied on the predictable, slightly sluggish roll of the Messerschmitt to inform their dogfighting tactics. Now, their timing was off. Maneuvers that had guaranteed a kill in May were now resulting in the German aircraft escaping, or worse, reversing the fight and getting a shot on the Allied tail. Pilots became cautious, hesitant, uncertain of the enemy's true capability. The German High Command finally learned of the modification in October 1944. An uncompromising technical inspector at an overhaul depot, noticing the wear patterns on the clevis pins, traced the repetitive anomaly back to the field units and finally found the small, non-standard S-shaped wire during a detailed disassembly. The initial reaction, as Krauss feared, was disciplinary action. The modification violated a dozen safety regulations, and the officer in charge demanded a court-martial for the involved ground crew for tampering with flight controls. However, the pilot corps, led by Rudel and other top experts, descended on the technical command. They presented the undeniable data. Squadrons using the Krauss trick had measurably superior combat survival rates and kill-to-loss ratios. They testified that the modification was the only thing keeping them alive against the increasing numbers of Allied fighters. They argued the choice was simple: a slight technical violation that saved lives, or adherence to an obsolete manual that guaranteed deaths. Messerschmitt's engineering department was forced to conduct an immediate analysis. They ran high-speed, high-G flight tests, calculated the stress loads, and measured the roll rate improvement. Their official conclusion was that the modification was indeed safe and critically effective. It essentially corrected a flaw inherent in the mass-produced cable system of the late-model Bf-109Gs. The modification, slightly refined and using a small, factory-produced spring clip instead of scavenged wire, was immediately integrated into the final Bf-109K-4 series aircraft coming off the production line. However, Feldwebel Dieter Krauss received no commendation, no medal, and no mention in the official Rüstungsministerium report. Instead, he received a formal, written reprimand for failure to adhere to standardized maintenance protocols, but was quietly given a Sonderauftrag special assignment to train other field mechanics on the new tensioning procedure. He continued his work, meticulous as ever, knowing that his simple, unauthorized fix had fundamentally changed the capabilities of the aircraft and saved dozens, perhaps scores, of pilots who had the wire installed. Lieutenant Egon Voss survived the war. He flew 48 combat missions, shooting down 14 Allied aircraft, crediting his survival entirely to the instantaneous response of his modified Bf-109. He returned to Saxony in 1945, a survivor in a shattered nation. After the war, Voss tracked down Krauss. They remained friends for decades, meeting every year to share a beer and remember the chaotic terror of the air battles and the crucial silence of the hangar where a small piece of wire made the difference. Krauss survived the war too and returned to his hometown, opening a small auto Werkstatt car repair garage. He never talked much about the war or his contribution. When asked, he'd simply say he was a mechanic. He fixed what was broken. It is estimated that the Krauss trick, the simple S-shaped antenna wire tensioner, saved well over 70 German fighter pilots who would have been lost in the high-G turning fights of 1940. The design flaw was so small, so subtle, yet so consequential that it took an enlisted mechanic with a practical, hands-on understanding of the machine and the courage to ignore regulations to find the solution. Dieter Krauss died in 1908. His obituary mentioned his service in the Luftwaffe as a ground mechanic. It did not mention the Antennendraht. It did not mention that he had temporarily reversed the tactical superiority of the Spitfire in the dogfight. His garage remains in his hometown, still fixing cars, still an anonymous monument to the enlisted ingenuity that wins wars when the engineers fail to see the obvious. The best solutions in war often come from the bottom up, from those who are close enough to the problem to risk everything to fix it.